Until around 5,000 years ago, with the origin of and this was the state of affairs until around 5,000 years ago, with the origin of civilization in the rigid sense, a society based upon cities. The first civilizations arose mainly in the Middle East and along the Indus River, but they also emerged independently in Central America and the Andes. Social stratification exploded in these societies. It is at this time when we see tablets engraved for the first time with the symbol for slave girl. Archaeology of these early civilizations show a great unequal distribution of wealth. In the ancient Sumerian city of Ishuna, we see a few large houses with about 200 square meters of floor area, while the vast majority of houses in the city have only about 50 square meters. These civilizations were the first in history to subsist almost entirely on domesticated food. And this is a quote from Chris Hartman again. Grain was stored in sizable buildings, which, standing out from the surrounding land, came to symbolize the continuity and preservation of social life. Those who had supervised the granaries became the most prestigious group in society, overseeing the life of the rest of the population as they gathered in, stored, and distributed the surplus. The storehouses and their controllers came to seem like powers over and above society, the key to its success, which demanded obedience and praise from the mass of people. They took on an almost supernatural aspect. The storehouses were the first temples, their superintendents the first priests. The combination of an exploding population, a constant destruction of the local environment, as is the case when large-scale agriculture is practiced because the natural vegetation needs to be cleared out and replaced often with a monocrop. When that happens, massive soil erosion sets in and nutrient depletion also sets in. So this process called desertification. Topsoil, which is only present in climax ecosystems, requires thousands of years to develop. It's very quickly washed away when these practices set in, though. And also the inabilities of cities to provide their own resources made civilization a massive, all-consuming war machine. Constant military expansion, imperialism, and colonialism are some of the defining features of civilization. Native American author Jack D. Forbes calls this the Wendigo disease. Wendigo is a Native American word for cannibal, consumers of human flesh. He says to a considerable degree the development of the Wendigo disease corresponds to the rise of what Europeans call civilization. This is no mere coincidence. He goes on to say, a society is only highly esteemed by the writers of civilization when it produces huge monuments, impressive public works, accumulates great surplus wealth, and has a leisure class. The creation of such material products or their accumulation is, of course, closely associated with imperialism and stratified social systems. Therefore, the European thinker tends to greatly admire empires and authoritarian societies. It is precisely these kinds of societies which are Wendigo. They are the ones where exploitation of others is accepted, at least by the rulers, as a proper or at least necessary way of life. Philosopher Lewis Mumford wrote of democracy and its relationship to the scale of society. He said, democracy, in the primal sense, I shall use the term, is necessarily most visible in relatively small communities and groups, whose members meet frequently face-to-face, interact freely, and are known to each other as persons. As soon as large numbers are involved, democratic association must be supplemented by a more abstract, depersonalized form. Historic experience shows that it is much easier to wipe out democracy by an institutional arrangement that gives authority only to those at the apex of the social hierarchy than it is to incorporate democratic practices into a well-organized system under centralized direction, which achieves the highest degree of mechanical efficiency when those who work it have no mind or purpose of their own. The tension between small-scale association and large-scale organization, between personal autonomy and institutional regulation, between remote control and diffused local intervention, has now created a critical situation. If our eyes had been open, we might long ago have discovered this conflict deeply embedded in technology itself. Now, having addressed domestication and scale, we can now move on to technology. Here I will be addressing the system of technology as it exists in industrialized countries. In the early 1800s, British textile artisans rebelled against the Industrial Revolution by attacking mechanized looms. The Industrial Revolution was wreaking havoc on their way of life. forcing the artisans out of their homes in the country and into the filthy, smog-ridden urban centers. They were now forced to work for wealthy capitalists who could afford the large mechanized looms and completely reordering society without their consent. The Luddite social movement gained so much support and momentum that machine breaking was a crime punishable by death. And at one time, there were more British soldiers fighting the Luddites than the forces of Napoleon. They were ultimately defeated, though. But there is a lesson to be learned from them. The system of technology has incredible effects upon society, and one of its more important aspects is its acceleration of the destruction of communities and the biosphere. Industrialism, writes Kirkpatrick Sale, is characterized by the squeezing of farm populations and the uncontrollable growth of cities, the evisceration of self-reliant communities, the enlargement of central governments, the enthronement of science as ruling ideology, a wide and increasing gap between rich and poor, and ruling values of profit, growth, property, and consumption. It was so in the early 19th century of Britain, in the late 19th century of the United States, the 20th century of Japan, and seems indeed to be so in the process of industrialization everywhere. Let's take, for one example, television. The Dene Indians were a tribe living in the Northwest Territories of Canada, and until recently were some of the last remaining Native American tribes who still retained a degree of autonomy and community that was found in most tribes before the closing of the frontier. But they were under constant bombardment by, among others, cable television companies. After a long period of resistance, the Dene family gave in, and satellite dishes were installed. The effects were fast, and their traditional society disintegrated equally as fast. Members of the tribe stopped visiting one another and instead stayed in their homes to watch television, and the values communicated through television were those of the white oppressors. This is not due to what was on television. This is due to the nature of television, which is not a democratic means for communicating information between individuals. Television is necessarily a centralized technology which disperses from generally one small source to the rest of the population. Similar effects can be seen on society with inventions such as telephones, the internet, and cars, which, as they have been introduced to societies, have universally resulted in the large-scale destruction of those communities. And now for my rousing conclusion. In the late 1800s, after the frontier was closed and the natives living in the United States were all but destroyed, a spiritual leader named Wovoka created the Ghost Dance, which promised to destroy the imperialist white culture, free the Indians, and return the herds of buffalo. Anarcho-Primitivists are modern-day ghost dancers. They are Luddites rebelling against a dystopic future dreamt up by a barbarous technocracy which consumes all in its path.